Lucas Minter had never intended to get involved in neighborhood politics, and for the most part, he succeeded in staying invisible. His house stood at the northern edge of the residential grid, just far enough from the main street that no one passed by unless they had a reason. The house wasn't anything special at first glance. Split-level, weathered siding, a modest lawn, but it sat on one of the few lots that retained its original zoning privileges from before the area's digital transformation. That detail, buried deep in local property records, meant Lucas's home was exempt from certain community management ordinances that had been enacted after the digital control platform took over the neighborhood's infrastructure. He never used it as leverage. In fact, he rarely mentioned it to anyone. But the implications of that exemption would come to define the storm he was about to walk into. Lucas wasn't an introvert in the way most people understood it. He didn't hate people. He simply respected space, his and others. After moving into the house 5 years earlier, he kept to himself but paid his dues, waved at neighbors when they crossed paths, and occasionally offered help when someone struggled with heavy packages or gardening equipment. Most people saw him as polite, competent, and vaguely unapproachable. No one really knew what he did for a living. That was mostly because Lucas himself wasn't entirely sure how to define it anymore. He used to do systems integration work, long hours at anonymous tech firms, building server architecture for clients who didn't care about anything but uptime and bandwidth. Eventually, he burned out, cashed in some stock options, and walked away. The house he now occupied belonged to his cousin at one point, a guy who ran IT for the neighborhood's digital transition program. When he moved out of state, Lucas bought the house through a private arrangement and inherited, along with it, an unusual responsibility. In the basement, housed behind a locked reinforced door that most would mistake for a utility closet, sat a small but critical server array. It wasn't particularly impressive to look at, just 3 racks of equipment, humming softly beside the power distribution units and temperature control system, but what those servers did made them irreplaceable. They ran the entire back-end infrastructure for the residential zone's digital management network. Gate control, access logs, surveillance feeds, maintenance scheduling, billing notifications, sensor telemetry, even the encrypted key management system, for the smart door locks most residents had installed over the past 3 years. All of it flowed through those machines in Lucas's basement. They weren't property of the community board. They were privately maintained, privately powered, and under a legacy custodial agreement that was never formally transferred to the new administration. The board knew the servers existed, but no one on the current leadership team truly understood how dependent they still were on them. Lucas didn't bring it up. He made sure the system stayed online, applied patches, rerouted traffic when errors cropped up, and absorbed the power bill himself. He figured he was doing everyone a favor by keeping it quiet and working. But silence and utility never last forever in places where people confuse control with contribution. It began, as most things do, with a small procedural memo. Lucas found it taped to his front door one Friday morning in a clear plastic sleeve. It was printed on the neighborhood letterhead but unsigned, and it informed him, without explanation, that a scheduled compliance audit of perimeter cabling and telecom lines would take place the following Monday. The note instructed residents to ensure their external cabling was labeled and aligned with community infrastructure guidelines. Lucas read it twice before tossing it on the kitchen counter, more annoyed by the lack of clarity than the content. No one had contacted him directly, and he hadn't heard of any such audit in the usual bulletin updates. Still, he walked the perimeter of his property that afternoon, double-checked the fiber conduit to the basement intake, and confirmed everything was exactly as it had been for 5 years. The audit team never knocked. Sometime late Monday morning, while Lucas was in a Zoom call with a friend reviewing a project roadmap, the internet cut out mid-sentence. His machine froze, disconnected, and wouldn't re-establish a signal. At first, he assumed it was the provider's fault. He checked the router. Status lights were out. The battery backup had switched on, but the optical light wasn't receiving any data. He pulled on a hoodie, went out the side door, and followed the fiber line to the distribution box at the sidewalk. The cover had been removed. The lock was gone. His cable was severed, clean, surgical, like it had been done with a precision blade. There was no note, no contact number, no explanation, just a deadline and an open port. He stood there for several minutes in disbelief, trying to make sense of it. Then he noticed the marking on the cable sleeve. It had been tagged with a red adhesive label that read, "Non-compliant, remove." His name was written in Sharpie next to it. It wasn't just an error, it was intentional. Someone had issued a command, and someone else had followed it. Furious but focused, Lucas walked back inside, powered up his LTE hotspot, and connected to the server terminal manually. What he saw turned annoyance into dread. All server activity had gone dark. Uplink offline. Gate control packets timing out. Backup authentication not responding. Logs incomplete. The system wasn't just disconnected, it was paralyzed, and that meant the entire neighborhood's digital infrastructure was down with it. Within an hour, residents began to notice. Entry gates jammed shut. Digital lock access timed out. Parcel lockers failed to authenticate. The community web portal returned error 503 on all pages. No one outside Lucas's house understood why, but complaints started flooding the emergency line, and by sunset, the board had issued a vague community-wide alert that unplanned network outages were being investigated. Lucas, meanwhile, was already 2 steps ahead. He contacted his provider and requested a detailed report of the service termination. The representative confirmed what Lucas suspected. The disconnect was unauthorized. A third party had filed a fraudulent infrastructure removal request, bypassing account verification by posing as a contractor operating on behalf of the local board. The provider had no proof of site approval and had already escalated the incident to legal. They issued a service restoration order, but warned Lucas it could take up to 48 hours to resolve due to physical tampering and the need for a technician to reinstall the fiber line. Lucas sat in the dim basement that night, surrounded by silent machines and blinking red diagnostics. For the first time in years, he realized how fragile the illusion of order had become. People assumed infrastructure was invisible, automatic, incorruptible, but it wasn't. It was wires, plastic, fragile code, and human assumptions. And now, someone, somewhere in this neighborhood, had made the mistake of believing they could control what they didn't understand. And so the question wasn't whether Lucas would respond. It was when. And how hard. By morning, the neighborhood was already unraveling. Lucas stood in his kitchen with a mug of coffee growing cold in his hand, watching the alert feed on his backup terminal. Over 100 individual system faults had been logged overnight, and each one pointed to a growing collapse of the digital infrastructure that the neighborhood had built its entire management model upon. The street gates hadn't opened since dusk. At least 4 houses had reported lockouts from their smart entry systems. Parcel deliveries had been delayed or returned to sender because the smart drop-off lockers failed to authenticate delivery credentials. Motion-activated exterior lights across multiple lots had defaulted to a factory cycle, blinking on and off every 10 seconds like some low-budget warning system. The chaos was technical, but the fallout was personal. People were irritated, confused, and starting to ask dangerous questions. Lucas hadn't slept. Instead, he spent the night documenting everything. Time-stamped server logs, photos of the severed cable, a certified letter drafted to the provider's fraud and security team, and a chain of internal tracer routes proving the moment of failure. He wasn't going to be the guy who shouted at meetings or started ranting in a group chat. He knew that rarely accomplished anything. But he was going to build a case that couldn't be ignored, starting with the facts. Around 8 a.m., just as the sun pierced through the edge of his blinds, he saw her, Karen Doral, standing at the intersection of Ashworth Drive and Pendleton Avenue, clipboard in hand, speaking with two men in reflective vests. One pointed toward Lucas's house while the other gestured back toward the utility box where the fiber connection had been severed. Lucas watched from the window. He recognized the dynamic immediately. Karen wasn't asking questions. She was directing traffic. She had always been an opportunist masquerading as a caretaker. On paper, Karen was simply a longtime resident with a passion for community stability. In practice, she operated like a petty monarch, distributing passive-aggressive directives through bulletin boards and digital notices, leveraging small procedural violations into acts of authority. She wasn't formally elected to anything meaningful, but she chaired 4 subcommittees, co-authored 3 minor amendments to the neighborhood policies, and attended every management meeting whether she was on the agenda or not. What she lacked in actual jurisdiction, she made up for with volume and conviction. And now, it seemed, she had taken a particular interest in Lucas and his unassuming server stack. That made her dangerous. Lucas didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, he pulled up the residential network database, the same one that until recently had managed everything from resident account balances to streetlight scheduling. It was mostly down now, but local logs had stored enough metadata to give him context. He checked system requests filed in the past 7 days and found a peculiar entry, an infrastructure compliance review form submitted from Karen's property. The document was vague, listing non-standard cabling observed and potential safety violations regarding private data equipment. The request ID was valid, but it had been filed under a general override account, normally used only by designated contractors or systems engineers, and that account hadn't been touched in years. The implication was clear. Someone had accessed privileged permissions to submit the shutdown request. Someone who either guessed, or more likely was told, how to bypass the approval chain. Lucas had a sinking suspicion that this wasn't just about the server. This was about removing a variable. He was one of the few people left in the neighborhood who operated outside the convenience-driven bubble the digital system created. He didn't use the app for garbage collection schedules. He didn't opt into the community bulletin. He didn't sync his lock system with the master override hub, and that made him inconvenient. Around midday, Lucas received a knock at the door. Not the usual kind, not a polite tap from a neighbor or casual visit. It was loud, deliberate, almost practiced. He opened the door to find a man in his mid-30s with a municipal ID clipped to his windbreaker. He introduced himself as Travis Belden, a utility compliance observer assigned to verify community infrastructure updates. Lucas asked to see credentials, and to the man's credit, he produced a digital badge and a letter of authorization with the city's Department of Residential Systems. Lucas skimmed the letter and saw that it was real, but the inspection had not been initiated by the city. It had been formally requested by a community leadership liaison on the grounds of potential safety interference. Lucas asked who submitted the request. The man hesitated, then shrugged. Name on file is Karen Doral. Lucas didn't deny access. That would only give them ammunition. Instead, he invited Travis to walk the perimeter with him, pointed out the severed line, and explained that the server equipment in the basement was private property maintained under a standing custodial agreement for the digital network, a role Lucas had inherited when he purchased the house. He showed the man backup logs, UPS performance charts, and safety certifications on all components. Travis seemed surprised, not at the equipment itself, but at the fact that it was still the backbone of the system. "They told us all this was migrated last year," he muttered. Lucas said nothing. He didn't need to explain the difference between assumptions and technical reality. The visit ended without incident, but the weight of it lingered. Someone had lied to the city. Someone had told them the infrastructure was obsolete, and in doing so, they had jeopardized access to critical systems for over 100 households. Lucas knew that if this went to litigation, The first thing a judge would ask was why no one followed up before cutting the line. But before it got that far, there was something else he needed to confirm. He made 3 phone calls that afternoon. First, to the original developer of the server architecture, an older systems consultant named Bernard Sloan, who had worked with Lucas's cousin back during the platform's implementation phase. Bernard was semi-retired now, but still answered emails when bored. Lucas explained what happened. Bernard laughed bitterly and said, "They still using that thing? I thought they'd ripped it all out." Lucas told him the truth. Bernard was quiet for a moment, then said he'd dig through his archives and see what documentation he still had. Lucas thanked him and moved on to call number 2. A friend from the provider side who owed him a favor. She promised to expedite the service ticket and send a technician out with a clean drop within 24 hours. Finally, Lucas called his attorney, not for action, but for preparation. He explained the situation in full, asked for a review of liability risk, and requested a list of steps to protect his property rights should things escalate further. By evening, the air in the neighborhood was thick with tension. Rumors were spreading. Someone's daughter had been stuck inside a garage with a failed override lock. A diabetic resident had lost access to their automated insulin alert system. Even the street sensors controlling timed watering for community landscaping had defaulted, leaving entire sections of the greenbelt flooded. Karen issued a public statement via the bulletin board, urging patience and promising a transition to a more secure and accountable management system. Lucas read the message and realized she had already begun rewriting the narrative. The servers hadn't failed. They were being replaced, and he was merely the stubborn holdout refusing to evolve with the times. It was exactly the kind of tactic she would use: mask incompetence as progress, disguise sabotage as reform. Lucas didn't reply. He knew better than to fight her in the arena she controlled. Instead, he returned to the basement, turned on the auxiliary terminal, and began writing a formal systems integrity report. Not for the board. Not even for the city. But for the record, something to document the exact sequence of events, the cause of failure, the identities involved, and the technical responsibilities clearly outlined in the original infrastructure agreement. He wasn't preparing for a confrontation. He was preparing for discovery, because someone was about to realize that cutting the cord didn't just disconnect a wire. It severed the operating spine of the entire community. And the one person who knew how to rebuild it wasn't interested in helping the people who had just tried to erase him. The technician arrived just before noon the next day, a wiry, red-bearded man named Ellis who introduced himself with a firm handshake and a wary glance at the utility box where the damage had been done. He said little as he unpacked his tools, working methodically while Lucas watched from a few feet away, arms crossed. Ellis had reviewed the notes from Lucas's provider contact and already knew the basic outline: unauthorized disconnect, suspected fraud, and the need to re-establish service with a new line. But as he pulled back the old conduit and examined the clean slice on the fiber, he let out a low whistle that Lucas didn't miss. "This was no mistake," Ellis muttered. "This is contractor-grade work. You don't get a cut this clean unless you're paid to be precise." Lucas didn't reply. He simply nodded, already anticipating the implication. Someone in the neighborhood had deliberately ordered the termination using industrial labor, not some confused volunteer with a pair of shears, but a coordinated action masked as community compliance. By the time Ellis reconnected the new line and ran signal verification, Lucas had already restored limited access to the core server functions. He didn't push everything live, yet. Instead, he isolated the authentication layer, bringing up only the gate control and emergency systems. If anyone questioned him, he could truthfully say he was acting in good faith, preserving essential services while investigating a breach. But as the diagnostics lit up across the basement terminal and the data trickled back into stable sync, Lucas felt something shift inside him. A sense of purpose, cold and controlled, replacing the residual anxiety from the previous 2 days. They had drawn first blood. Now it was time to show them what they'd severed. Within 2 hours of the partial restoration, the board issued a hasty memo, thanking temporary volunteers for their patience and praising the new infrastructure rollout for stabilizing high-priority functions. No technical details, no timeline, and no mention of the fact that nothing had been rolled out except the exact same system Karen had tried to eliminate. Lucas expected the gaslighting. What he didn't expect was the follow-up. A letter, hand-delivered, signed by the Interim Infrastructure Review Board and marked Formal Inquiry. It stated that a resident, unnamed, had expressed concerns that Lucas's basement server setup posed a long-term safety hazard and that his equipment must be inspected for compliance with new local ordinances. The language was careful, vague enough to sound administrative, but precise enough to threaten access to private property if non-compliance was suspected. Lucas read it once, twice, then slowly placed it face down on the kitchen table and stared at the grain of the wood beneath his knuckles. He knew what this was. It was a shot across the bow, a test to see whether he'd flinch, whether he'd concede ground or invite another round of interference. But this time, Lucas wasn't going to wait for the storm to reach his door. He was going to open it himself. He started with the city building records office. Not online. He drove there in person. He requested full documentation on infrastructure inspections for his block going back 6 months. When the clerk asked why, he said he needed records for an insurance claim. Within 20 minutes, he had the file in his hands. Not a single inspection, ordinance update, or code violation on file. Whatever justification Karen and her allies were using, it wasn't rooted in actual policy. Next, he visited the Municipal Utilities Commission office and asked to speak to the Director of Compliance. When they told him she was in a meeting, he waited 2 hours in the lobby with a manila folder in his lap and a thermos of black coffee that he never opened. When she finally emerged, Lucas introduced himself, explained what had happened, and calmly presented photos of the cut cable, the forged service request, and a notarized statement from Ellis confirming the unauthorized nature of the disconnection. The director listened carefully, asked 2 technical questions, then told him, "We'll be investigating this ourselves. If someone is forging work orders, we'll find out." Lucas left the building without a word, got into his truck and sat there for a long moment, breathing steadily. He wasn't angry. He was methodical. The kind of quiet resolve that doesn't broadcast intent but acts with clarity. Back at home, he assembled a digital package. Copies of every record he'd gathered, the provider statement, inspection records, legal documents, the infrastructure agreement from Bernard, and a video of the reconnection process from the technicians' body camera. He sent it to his attorney with a note. Prepare pre-litigation letter. Property rights violation, infrastructure sabotage, intentional interference. The next morning, Karen escalated. A public bulletin was posted on the neighborhood forum, announcing a community meeting to address unsafe independent technical installations. The message used Lucas's address without naming him, but the intent was unmistakable. She framed it as a forum for public transparency, inviting residents to discuss the future of safe, community-managed digital services. Lucas didn't respond. Instead, he sent a private message to 5 residents he knew by name, people he'd helped before without expecting anything in return. One of them was a retired teacher whose lock system he'd repaired when the board refused to assist. Another was a single mother who relied on the digital gate system to feel safe at night. A third was a veteran who had trouble walking and whose access codes had recently stopped working due to a system upgrade no one could explain. Lucas didn't ask them to speak. He simply explained what had happened and gave them the facts. They made their own decisions. The meeting was held in the community room of the shared fitness facility, an antiseptic room with plastic chairs, fake plants, and the smell of overused HVAC filters. Karen stood at the front with a microphone, flanked by 2 junior board members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. The room was fuller than expected. Word had spread. Karen opened with a long-winded monologue about modernization and security, warning that unauthorized legacy systems posed a risk to data integrity and resident safety. Lucas watched from the back, arms crossed, silent. When she asked if anyone wanted to speak, the retired teacher raised her hand. "My access door failed last week," she said. "Lucas fixed it. No one from the board responded to my ticket." Karen smiled thinly and deflected. The mother stood next. "The new app you installed doesn't work on my phone. His system always did." Karen tightened her grip on the microphone. "These are isolated." The veteran stood last. He held up a crumpled notice from the board. "This says I'm non-compliant because I don't use the new lock system. My leg barely works. Am I dangerous now?" The room shifted. The tension was no longer abstract. It had a face, a name, and a history. Karen's narrative collapsed not because Lucas argued, but because others remembered. The meeting ended without a vote. Karen left early, avoiding eye contact. Lucas waited until the last person exited, then walked to the front of the room and picked up the microphone, though no one remained to hear him. He didn't speak. He simply looked at the room, then at the door, then at the bulletin on the wall still marked with the words, "Unsafe Installation." He left it there. Let them read it tomorrow. When Lucas returned home that evening, a white envelope was wedged into the seam of his front door. It had no stamp, no return address, just a single line typed in the 12-point Times New Roman. "If you escalate this, we'll escalate too." He read it, folded it, and placed it in the fireproof safe next to his legal correspondence. He didn't need threats to take this seriously, but now he had evidence of intent, and that, more than any sabotage, would be the mistake they couldn't take back. Lucas had never expected to find an ally in Bernard Sloan. The man was in his late 60s, mostly off the grid, with a reputation for disappearing from projects halfway through only to reappear months later with an elegant solution no one had asked for. But when Bernard returned Lucas's call with a short message, "Found the archive, meet me," and sent an address to a storage facility on the industrial edge of town, Lucas didn't hesitate. The facility was a half-hour drive and barely staffed, the kind of place where people rented units and never came back for what they stored. Bernard stood outside Unit 302, wearing a faded denim jacket and holding an old aluminum clipboard like it was a shield. He didn't smile when he saw Lucas. Instead, he handed him a thumb drive wrapped in a Ziploc bag and said, "Everything you need to bury them is on here, including a copy of the original custodial agreement and the server-to-node dependencies they pretended didn't exist." They sat on 2 overturned milk crates in the cold unit while Bernard explained what the board had always tried to hide. That the transition to a cloud-based neighborhood management system had never been fully completed. The infrastructure backbone, the real architecture behind all the digital control, still relied on the local node that resided in Lucas's basement. Karen's new system had been overlaid on top of it, but was never decoupled. That meant every digital action taken in the past 3 years, every lock, every gate, every resident credential, had been authenticated through Lucas's servers, whether anyone realized it or not. Even more damning, the board had failed to renew its equipment lease with the municipal tech partner, meaning the only copy of the full resident access key database still lived on a drive 3 feet from Lucas's water heater. And that drive, unlike their servers, had never failed. Lucas returned home with the thumb drive in his jacket pocket and a weight in his chest that wasn't anxiety. It was leverage. As he loaded the data onto his backup system and began verifying its authenticity, his heart rate barely changed. Everything checked out. Signature timestamps, matching server keys, backup logs. Bernard had kept everything. Lucas didn't broadcast the discovery. He didn't post warnings or alerts. Instead, he forwarded a digital copy of the agreement to his attorney, along with a memo. This constitutes proof of infrastructural ownership and dependency. Please prepare an injunction should further action be taken against my equipment or property." He thought that would be the end of it for a while, a moment of pause where silence replaced threats. But instead, the retaliation arrived even faster than before. That Friday, just before sundown, a temporary compliance tag appeared on Lucas's front gate, a red plastic seal with the words, "Pending safety review, do not modify." It had been zip-tied to the latch without warning. Lucas removed it immediately, documented the incident, and contacted the sheriff's office to report tampering with private property. The deputy who arrived was polite but non-committal, clearly uncomfortable with the gray area between residential policy and criminal trespass. "Look," he said after Lucas showed him the video footage, "they'll claim it's part of a neighborhood inspection. If you want to push this, you'll have to get a judge involved." Lucas nodded and thanked him. He didn't argue. He didn't need the deputy's sympathy. He needed the paper trail. And now he had it. The next day, 2 more houses experienced mysterious system errors. One resident's garage door opened and remained stuck open for 3 hours, compromising home security. Another reported their access card failing in the middle of the night, leaving them locked outside with the child in tow. Both incidents were quietly logged by Lucas's server, which was still recording node-level authentication failures even though most of its services were suspended. He tagged the errors, printed the logs, and filed them as part of a technical affidavit he had begun assembling with his legal team. Karen, meanwhile, pushed forward with her campaign. She scheduled a closed-door, technical review board meeting and posted a notice that a vote would soon be held to formally transfer management duties to an external cloud partner. The partner was unnamed, the platform was unclear, and no migration. Details were provided. It was a power grab disguised as modernization. Lucas saw through it immediately. If the vote passed, the board would claim that his server was now obsolete, and anything that followed, disconnection, confiscation, termination, could be framed as cleanup, not retribution. But Lucas had one more move. He sent a private letter, not an email, not a message board post, but a printed and signed letter, to every household in the neighborhood. The letter didn't accuse, didn't dramatize, didn't even name names. It was 3 paragraphs long. The first outlined the history of the server system and how it had functioned as the digital backbone for their community. The second detailed the events of the recent sabotage and the risks posed by hasty transitions to unvetted platforms. The third offered a solution: a fully transparent, resident-controlled audit of all infrastructure systems, past, present, and future. The letter ended with one sentence, underlined and bold: "Decisions about the integrity of our neighborhood should not be made behind closed doors." Lucas didn't wait for reactions. He resumed his maintenance schedule, updated the server firmware, and sent Bernard a thank you package with a bottle of whiskey and a signed note that read, "Still standing." What he didn't expect was what came next. 3 days later, a group of residents knocked on his door, not to confront, not to criticize, but to ask questions. Real questions. How the system worked. Why no one had known. Whether it was safe. Lucas didn't lecture. He showed them. He opened the door to the basement, walked them through the physical setup, explained the UPS configuration and cooling system, and answered every question with honesty. When they left, they didn't look confused or angry. They looked relieved. Lucas didn't smile. But for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to believe that the ground had begun to shift. Not with speeches or threats, with facts. And people, when shown facts in the right light, sometimes chose to see clearly. The knock at Lucas's door came just before dawn. The kind of knock that's meant to wake you up. Not the panicked pounding of someone in trouble, but the cold, deliberate cadence of a visitor who expects compliance. Lucas was already awake, sipping lukewarm coffee in his living room chair, dressed and waiting for the inevitable. He opened the door slowly, careful to keep the chain engaged, and found two uniformed officers standing on his porch, one tall and square-jawed, the other shorter, eyes twitchy from too much caffeine or too little sleep. The taller one introduced himself as Deputy Wallace, said they had a report of a resident refusing to comply with a lawful infrastructure inspection. Lucas didn't blink, didn't shift his posture. He asked who filed the report. Wallace hesitated, then replied that it came from an acting member of the Residential Oversight Board, which Lucas knew meant Karen. When asked if they had a warrant, the deputy cleared his throat, shuffled through a folder, and admitted they did not, but that they had been advised to ensure cooperation. Lucas nodded, said he appreciated their professionalism, and explained that the servers were private property, protected under a valid custodial agreement still recognized by the city and currently under review by legal counsel. Wallace seemed caught between indifference and irritation, clearly just doing his job and eager to not be part of something that looked increasingly like a neighborhood dispute spiraling out of control. The shorter officer shifted his weight uncomfortably, murmured something about this being above their pay grade, and after a few more minutes of tense but civil exchange, the officers departed without stepping inside. Lucas closed the door, double-locked it, and exhaled slowly. The escalation had arrived, formal enough to rattle, informal enough to deny responsibility. The next volley wasn't legal. It was operational. That same afternoon, residents across the neighborhood received an emergency update through the temporary management portal installed by Karen's allies. The notice claimed a massive security flaw had been discovered in the legacy system still partially operating in the background, and that, for the safety of all residents, a forced switchover would occur within 72 hours. No further detail was given, no audit report was published, and no technical specifics were included. The language was urgent, designed to panic. Lucas recognized it instantly. It was the digital equivalent of yelling fire in a crowded theater, cause chaos, then claim to be the only one holding the extinguisher. He didn't react publicly. Instead, he began a forensic mirror of the server's data, isolating every access attempt, every new credential input, every signature mismatch. Over the next 30 hours, he tracked 9 distinct intrusion attempts, some clumsy, clearly automated, others more advanced, probing the periphery of the system like fingers searching for a fracture. Lucas had hardened the infrastructure years ago, even when he thought no one would ever care. But now he was grateful he had. The attempts failed. Each time, the system logged the packet origin, timestamp, and hash mismatch. And then, just after 3 a.m. on the second night, a new pattern emerged. Someone had bypassed the front end entirely and attempted to access the raw backend through an admin credential Lucas had retired 2 years ago. That meant they weren't guessing. They were using an old copy of the system, perhaps stolen, perhaps gifted by someone who'd once had legitimate access. Lucas traced the IP signature and matched it to a location within the neighborhood itself. They were attacking him from inside the grid. Lucas didn't sleep the rest of the night. He built a firewall trap, isolated the attempt, and let it run just long enough to confirm his suspicion. Then he shut it down. Hard. He copied the logs to a secure external drive, encrypted the contents, and prepared a report for both his attorney and Bernard. By sunrise, he had a full audit of what had been tried, who had tried it, and how they had failed. But the damage wasn't just technical. It was reputational. The emergency bulletin had rattled people. Several residents withdrew their public support, worried now that standing with Lucas made them a liability. Rumors circulated that his servers had been the source of the system collapse all along. One neighbor who'd once brought him fresh tomatoes from her garden now crossed the street to avoid eye contact. Then came the vandalism. Lucas returned home from the store one afternoon to find his garage door spray-painted with the words, "Tech Cancer." The letters were crude, uneven, clearly done in haste. He called the police, filed a report, and showed them footage from his perimeter camera. The figure was masked, hooded, but the height and build suggested someone local. The responding officer took the report seriously, said this was not the first sign of tensions in the area, and promised to increase patrols. Lucas nodded, thanked him, and replaced the garage panel himself the next day. He didn't speak to the press. Someone had apparently contacted a local news blog and tried to pitch the story. But Lucas had already warned his attorney, who issued a preemptive cease and desist to the site, citing harassment, defamation, and active litigation. Karen, meanwhile, leaned into her role as would-be savior. She began appearing in small resident gatherings with printed flyers, talking about digital accountability and taking back control from hidden systems. She referenced Lucas indirectly, describing him as a holdout from a failed era, warning that if the neighborhood didn't adapt, it would collapse. Some listened, others didn't. But the seed had been planted. Lucas saw the narrative forming like rot under fresh paint. She wasn't just trying to remove him, she was trying to erase him from the story entirely. That week, a packet arrived in Lucas's mailbox. No return address, no postage mark, just a plain manila envelope with a single USB drive inside. Lucas scanned it first, found no malware, then mounted it on an isolated system. The contents were stunning. A series of internal communications between board members, including Karen, discussing strategies to force a systems transition without formal resident approval. One email in particular stood out. A message from Karen to an IT consultant outlining a plan to fabricate a systems breach that would justify a forced platform migration. The file included a test script labeled Scenario 3, Legacy Access Compromise, and a note, Deploy if necessary. Lucas sat motionless for nearly an hour after reading it. Then he picked up the phone and called his attorney requesting an emergency injunction. The filing was made the next morning, an official motion to preserve infrastructure, prevent tampering, and demand a third-party audit of all neighborhood systems. It named Karen directly. When word spread, the board fell into chaos. Several members resigned immediately, citing lack of transparency. One issued a public apology. Karen remained silent, issuing no statement. Lucas didn't celebrate. Instead, he returned to the basement, checked the server logs, and began writing his own version of events. Not a defense, not an attack, but a chronicle. The truth as it happened in his own words. And for the first time in weeks he closed his eyes that night and slept. The courtroom wasn't large, nor was it particularly formal, just a converted municipal meeting space with rows of mismatched chairs, a few fluorescent lights flickering above, and a long folding table at the front where the judge sat flanked by two clerks tapping quietly on aging laptops. It was never supposed to come to this. Not over a set of servers in a private basement or a neighborhood dispute about digital authority, but the hearing had drawn a crowd, and not just the usual residents desperate for a sense of order. Representatives from the city's Technology Compliance Division, 2 independent contractors, and a quiet man in a dark suit from a state-level infrastructure oversight agency had all taken seats in the back row. Lucas sat alone at the petitioner's table. Hands folded, expression calm but alert, the result of too many sleepless nights and the slow realization that no one else was going to defend the truth unless he did it himself. Across from him sat Karen Doral, arms folded so tightly her knuckles had turned white, her face drawn into a smile that never reached her eyes. A woman cornered but still dangerous, still betting that bureaucracy would favor control over facts. The judge called the session to order with a dry formality, voice scratchy from years of dealing with liars and amateurs. Lucas's attorney stood and began laying out the timeline, detailing the unauthorized line severance, the false security breach bulletins, the forged documentation requesting a forced system migration, and the internal messages recovered from the Anonymous envelope implicating Karen and at least 2 other board members in a deliberate campaign to sabotage the existing infrastructure for personal control. Each exhibit was submitted in silence, and the only sound in the room was the faint whir of the HVAC system cycling dusty air through old vents. When Lucas was called to testify, he rose without hesitation, approached the witness stand, and began recounting the story. Not in the language of victimhood or anger, but in the clean, deliberate cadence of a man who had lived every frame of what he described. He spoke of how the system was originally constructed, how it was never properly transitioned, and how every authentication, access log, and emergency override still passed through the architecture Karen had tried to erase. He didn't dramatize the vandalism or the threats or the visit from the officers. He just told the truth. And when he was done, he stepped back, returned to his seat, and said nothing more. Karen's defense was less coherent. Her attorney, clearly brought in at the last minute, attempted to redirect the focus to safety concerns, painting Lucas's servers as outdated, unregulated, potentially dangerous. But when asked for documentation of inspections, incident reports, or expert opinions, he had none. When pressed on the timeline of the so-called transition, he hesitated, contradicted himself, and finally admitted that no full migration had ever occurred. The judge asked Karen directly if she had ever authorized the fabrication of a system breach scenario. Her eyes flicked toward her lawyer, who didn't speak. Then she said, quietly but clearly, "I believed it was necessary to create a controlled crisis in order to push necessary reforms." The room went silent. Even the clerks stopped typing. That sentence, simple and damning, carried more weight than any technical diagram or legal clause. It was intent made audible. Lucas didn't react. He didn't need to. The judge recessed for deliberation, and Lucas stepped outside into the windless afternoon air, leaning against the stone railing that bordered the courthouse's modest entrance. Residents began to emerge in small groups, some quiet, others murmuring. A few approached him, not with apologies or platitudes, but with questions. Real ones. What happens now? Will we lose access? Is the system safe? Lucas answered patiently, explaining that the injunction would force a third-party audit and that no resident data would be lost or exposed. He said the system wasn't perfect, but it was stable, and that if the audit proved otherwise, he'd support a proper transition, one with votes, transparency, and accountability. They listened. That was enough. When the judge returned and read the ruling, it was concise. The court found sufficient evidence of deliberate sabotage and abuse of authority. Karen was barred from participating in any future infrastructure decisions within the community. The Oversight Board was to be dissolved and reconstituted under a new interim structure, supervised by the city's Digital Systems Compliance Office. Lucas's servers were acknowledged as critical infrastructure and placed under protected status pending full audit. The fabricated breach plan, the false reports, and the unauthorized disconnections were entered into the public record. Karen left the courtroom without speaking to anyone. She didn't look at Lucas, didn't look at the residents, didn't look at the reporters who had begun to assemble near the parking lot. She simply walked to her car, opened the door, and drove away. No one followed. No one called after her. Lucas remained seated for a few minutes, staring at the empty judge's bench. There was no sense of victory, only a profound and quiet exhaustion, like the final minutes of a long storm when the rain has stopped but the sky hasn't cleared. He gathered his papers, shook his attorney's hand, and walked to his truck. When he returned home, the server room was still humming, unchanged, loyal. He ran a full diagnostic out of habit, checked the logs, and saw no new access attempts. For the first time in months, the system was quiet. And so was the neighborhood. In the weeks that followed the court's decision, the rhythm of the neighborhood shifted subtly, as if a long-held breath had finally been released, but no one was yet sure if it was safe to exhale. The server logs stabilized first, Lines of clean, predictable code flowing without disruption. Each command authenticated, each packet received without delay or anomaly. Lucas monitored them not with the vigilance of paranoia, but with the quiet duty of someone who understood that infrastructure was not about spectacle. It was about consistency. Outside, the digital gates resumed their hum of automated reliability. Parcel lockers reopened without glitch, and access logs returned to routine. The neighborhood, though it rarely acknowledged it directly, had settled back into a fragile order, one that most residents now recognized had been preserved not by the loudest voices, but by the one man they had nearly erased. Lucas kept to his routine, not out of stubbornness but out of discipline. He continued to update the firmware, run integrity checks, and file technical summaries with the interim committee now overseeing the neighborhood systems. This new board was smaller, quieter, composed mostly of residents who had watched the conflict unfold and understood that governance should not be driven by fear or ego, but by process. They didn't ask Lucas to join them, nor did he volunteer. But a clear and formal agreement was drawn up recognizing his role as the infrastructure steward, with oversight provisions and technical liaisons to ensure transparency. Lucas agreed to all of it. He had no interest in power. He only wanted the system to work. Karen's absence was neither celebrated nor mourned. Her house remained dark most evenings, a for sale sign appearing quietly in her yard one morning, the real estate listing vague and brief. She never returned to another meeting, never issued a statement, never tried to reclaim her influence. Some said she'd moved in with family out of state. Others whispered about legal consequences still unfolding. Lucas didn't care. Her exit was not a triumph. It was a footnote. The real story had never been about her, not really. It had been about the structure she tried to control and the people who finally saw through the illusion of her authority. Among those people, some had changed more visibly than others. The retired teacher who had once testified stood up during a resident meeting and suggested a new digital access training program for seniors. The veteran began volunteering as a technical liaison for accessibility issues. The single mother Lucas had helped joined the committee and began drafting clear guidelines for platform changes and data access. Small gestures, perhaps, but real ones. The infrastructure had been restored, but so had something harder to define. A trust not in machines, but in the idea that systems could still serve people when maintained with care and defended with resolve. Lucas watched all of it unfold from a distance. He declined interviews, ignored the occasional email from journalists, and kept his circle tight. On a quiet Saturday morning, he walked the perimeter of his property, checking the conduit and junction box one last time. Everything was clean, sealed, secure. When he reached the garage, he paused at the spot where the spray-painted insult had once stained the door. It had long since been replaced, but his fingers traced the spot out of habit, a tactile reminder that every line of defense eventually gets tested. He turned back, stepped into the basement, and ran one last diagnostic. No errors, no breaches, just silence, cool air, and the soft, constant hum of something that still worked because he had refused to let it fail. And when the screen confirmed that all systems were nominal, Lucas did something he hadn't done in months. He powered down the console, turned off the overhead light, and climbed the stairs, not to wait for the next problem, but simply to make coffee, sit in the morning sun, and watch the neighborhood function exactly as it was meant to. Quietly, reliably. Without fear.